Thanks, Annie, and good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us today to kick off the public development of the statewide kelp forest and eelgrass meadow health and conservation plan. So like Annie mentioned, my name is Max Showalter. I'm a policy advisor in the Office of Commissioner Franz, and I also have with me Cynthia Harbison, who's an environmental planner in DNR's Aquatic Resources Division. And we are co-leading this process for DNR to develop this plan. Next slide, please. As we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about what DNR is and why DNR is well suited to create this plan. So most of you might be familiar with DNR through recreation or our wildfire fighting forces, or maybe from our social media accounts. But what you may not know is DNR manages nearly 6 million acres of public lands in Washington state, of which about 2.6 million are aquatic. And what that means is that the lands underneath public and navigable waters, like Puget Sound, are typically managed by DNR. And so as a result, DNR is in a unique position to steward our aquatic habitats like kelp forests and eelgrass meadows, and also to manage and mitigate terrestrial stressors that impact the marine environment like sediment quality or stream water temperature. So if you'd like to learn more about DNR, you can visit our website at dnr.wa.gov or follow our social media. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that DNR is in a unique position to lead development of this statewide plan, but we also know that protecting and recovering our kelp forests and eelgrass meadows in Washington is a big challenge that takes all hands on deck. We're committed to fostering the partnerships and connections needed to ensure that we can all do our best to help steward the recovery of these environments. And that's why we're so excited to have so many folks here this evening to help us understand what's important to you, why DNR is committed to ensuring we create a plan together that is reflective of all the needs of everybody in Washington. We also recognize that this is a very long process, and the conversation this evening is just the beginning. So I know we won't be able to talk about everything today, which might feel challenging when there's so much to say about kelp and eelgrass, but we hope you'll continue to engage with us throughout the process and provide your feedback. Next slide, please. So I hope to touch on just these following items in just this short 20-minute overview and then open the floor up to questions like Annie mentioned. And our goal is to make sure that we all have the same baseline information for participating in the discussions today. So I know that there's a lot of detail about kelp and eelgrass and more questions you might have than we can cover in 20 minutes. So I encourage you to ask questions of the DNR experts that are on the call or visit our website where you can learn more about the plan itself. And we're going to start with just a short high-level overview of what kelp and eelgrass are, followed by some more details about the planning process and our progress so far. And then we'll close out this portion of the agenda with framing what we hope to gain today and how you all can help us learn more about what you'd like to see in the kelp and eelgrass plan. So click, please. So we're going to start with just a quick overview of what is kelp and eelgrass and why it's important. Next slide, please. So kelp is a name for a broad group of seaweeds, brown algae, which are not plants, but are similar in that they need light to grow through photosynthesis. So the structure of a kelp forest is similar to an upland forest in that there are species that are tall and form a canopy. These are called floating kelp. And there's also many kelp species that grow as the understory, which creates important complexity for fish and other organisms to thrive. Washington has 22 species of kelp, which makes it one of the most diverse kelp communities in the world. And all of these kelp species grow in rocky nearshore habitats. What you see in this picture is bull kelp, which is one of particular interest because it is the dominant floating kelp species in Puget Sound and also common on the coast. It grows really quickly. It reaches up to 40 feet tall over several weeks during the spring and summer, and it forms these long, narrow forests close to the shore that persist into the fall in areas shallower than 40 feet. So unlike upland forests that have trees that are hundreds of years old, bull kelp forests grow new every single year from spores that were shed in the previous year. Next slide, please. In contrast, seagrasses are plants, and they're perennial species and grow much like the grass in your lawn. Once seagrass meadows are established, they will expand through yearly growth and seed production. And eelgrass is an important species of seagrass that grows in soft sediments like sand and mud. They typically grow at depths of up to 15 feet, sometimes to 40 feet. And what you can see in this image on the right is just an example of a typical seagrass meadow. Next slide. Kelp forests and seagrass meadows are critical nearshore habitats for supporting diverse species, communities, including threatened and endangered species. So here's a schematic which shows just some of the species that rely on kelp and eelgrass. Kelp and eelgrass function as migratory corridors for salmon and provide important nursery habitats for juvenile chum and chinook. They're also important for birds, shellfish, marine mammals like otters, seals, and orca. Kelp and seagrass are also extremely good at taking up carbon from the atmosphere and from the water. So they are important habitats that contribute to blue carbon and climate resilience initiatives. I mentioned earlier that kelp grows on rocky bottoms while eelgrass grows on soft sediments. And so because kelp forests and eelgrass meadows dominate in different habitat types, together they create an important mosaic of nearshore submerged vegetation that supports diverse communities of fish, birds, and mammals all through Puget Sound and the state. And the coast. Next slide. DNR regularly maps kelp and eelgrass extent throughout Washington via our aquatic sciences or aquatic resources division. What you see here is a snapshot from DNR's nearshore habitat program, which maps distribution of floating and non-floating kelp. This is relatively old data from 2001, but what I wanted to do is bring it forward to show you just in general where you can find some kelp. So this is non-floating kelp. Remember, non-floating kelp are the understory kelps that don't float to the surface. An example is sugar kelp, which is shown here in the picture at the right, sticking out of the water at low tide. And you can see that non-floating kelp is widespread along the northwest coast, the Strait, and throughout Puget Sound. Non-floating kelp is much more abundant and widespread than species with floating canopies, and it's present on about 1/3 of Washington's coastlines. Next slide. Here's a similar image for floating kelp, which is often more visible to us as land dwellers. It's also easier for us as land dwellers to track. So in this picture on the right, you might recognize or have seen images like this in your life. This is a bull kelp bed floating on the surface. Floating kelp is present largely in the Strait, especially around the northern islands in the northern Puget Sound, and with patchy areas in central and south Puget Sound. It's present along about 1/10 of Washington's coastlines, but exhibits strong annual variability, which means, from year to year, even in healthy kelp beds, there's lots of changes in the area of the kelp. Next slide. So where are we concerned about kelp? What you see in this image on the left is a series of arrows superimposed on a map. And these arrows are showing generally areas from least to highest concern in the color gradient. So out on the coast in the purple, we generally consider the coastal and Strait kelp beds to be healthy, as indicated by the dark purple color. But as you move further into Puget Sound, and especially into Central and South Sound, these are areas where we've seen much bigger declines in kelp beds and their extent. In northern Puget Sound, you see the question mark. This is because we need some more long-term information to fully understand the trends. But in general, on the coast, kelp beds are still considered healthy. We're moving into Puget Sound, especially Central and South Sound. That's where we've observed some of the greatest kelp losses. Next slide, please. So again, we have a snapshot of extent of marine vegetation in the left on the map, and this time for eelgrass. As mentioned earlier, eelgrass needs some soft, shallow sediments to grow, and you can see on the map everywhere in purple is where eelgrass was observed by DNR in this data. There's two areas to highlight. So Central Puget Sound, of course, has lots of eelgrass, which you all might have seen when you're out tide pooling or out in the sound enjoying the water, or two other areas are the major estuaries along the coast. So areas like Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. And here are just two images to demonstrate what eelgrass looks like. Next slide. So where are we concerned about eelgrasses? Well, annual variability within an eelgrass meadow is less for kelp, but still expected. And we do see variability across sites in terms of trends, with some increasing and some decreasing, and on the whole, minimal detectable change. But what is concerning is that we see clusters of declining sites, particularly evident in the San Juan Islands, which is what we're showing you in this picture here. So this is an example of data taken by DNR in Westcott Bay on the northwest coast of San Juan Island. And on the left, you can see the yellow dots are indicating where eelgrass is present from a survey in 2000 to 2001. And then on the right, where the same survey was taken, but you can see there's far less eelgrass. And so there was this precipitous decline in eelgrass beginning in 2002, and restoration efforts have had low success, likely due to poor sediment and water quality conditions. So this is an example of the type of decline that we see for eelgrasses in these protected embayments, particularly in the San Juan Islands. Next slide, please. Okay, so why do we see areas of kelp and eelgrass in decline? Well, both kelp and eelgrass habitats are sensitive to water quality issues, particularly those listed here as physical stressors. So things like high temperatures or sediment impacting kelp and eelgrass. Click, please. We also see biological stressors that can impact kelp and eelgrass. For example, organisms that eat kelp and eelgrass, or in particular, other organisms that compete for light in space, especially from invasive species. Click, please. Many human activities also exacerbate some of these physical and biological stressors, especially things like pollution or shoreline development, which can shade kelp and eelgrass habitat from the light that the marine vegetation needs in order to grow. We don't know exactly why, all of the reasons why kelp and eelgrass are experiencing decline in particular areas, but we do know enough to target some of the major issues. Click, please. And our challenge with this plan is to pinpoint the key stressors that we can mitigate to improve kelp and eelgrass populations, not only today, but also in the future, especially as climate change amplifies some of the signals that we see from these other stressors and presents concurrent stressors to kelp and eelgrass. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what kelp and eelgrass are and learned that they're vital habitats in Washington state, but also vulnerable to environmental change. Now I want to give a quick overview of the statewide plan and what we're doing to tackle some of these challenges and what it will entail. Next slide, please. So the statewide plan is the result of a bill that passed the legislature in 2022, like Commissioner Franz mentioned in her introductory remarks. This means that DNR is required by law to create a plan, which includes the elements that you see here on the screen. So these elements include that we must identify at least 10,000 acres of priority habitat for kelp and eelgrass habitat for conservation and recovery by 2040. The plan has to ID stressors in these priority habitats, and we must also monitor distribution and trends in these priority habitats. And so you can see all of the elements in this plan center around these prioritized habitats, which are the acres which meet our criteria for most important for conservation and recovery. Next slide, please. Click, please. And again. So in 2023, DNR is working to develop a framework that helps us identify these priority acres for conservation and recovery. This is the stage in the process where we are now. Click again, please. And this is leading up to submitting the plan to the legislature by December 1st in 2023. Click, please. All of this entails the plan development stage, so the process where we identify the acres and go through the data and the planning in order to be able to identify and prioritize these areas. Click, please. And again. Beginning in 2024, we will enter the phase of plan implementation. Click, please. So DNR will work with tribes, communities, and other partners to identify sites for implementation of conservation and recovery efforts, matching tools from our toolkit to each specific area. And because so much of this process is location dependent, a lot of the work in this plan will take place in 2024 and beyond, when we've prioritized habitat and can begin to make local plans for conservation and recovery. And click one more time, please. This leads to our goal of at least 10,000 acres of habitat being conserved and restored by 2040. So we still have a lot of questions to answer in this process, what tools we can use, for example, or how we consider, large sites versus small patchy sites. But what we're focusing on today are just the very first steps of this conversation. Click one more time, please, and which is this place here on the left, creating this prioritization framework. Next slide, please. Okay, so the natural question that comes out of all of this, right, is how do we identify which habitats are most important? And that's the work that we have in front of us to work on together today. So within the bill, DNR is tasked to create a framework which includes development with partners to identify and prioritize these areas. And what you can see on the screen here is text that's lifted directly from the bill, tasking DNR to do so. Click, please. So this is our prioritization framework, which will consist of criteria which will be used to determine priority habitat based on what habitat is valuable, what habitat presents the most opportunity, and what habitat is most feasible. And our goal today is start to work together to be able to establish some of the pieces of this framework together. Next slide. I'm going to step through what we mean for each of the three categories that I just mentioned that will create the outline of our prioritization framework. So if you click once, so the first piece of the framework that I mentioned is values. So what we're asking here is what habitat provides the ecological, sociocultural, or economic values that we want. So we want to prioritize areas for conservation and recovery, which are important to how you have identified and helped us identify these ecological, economic, and social values of what we want for kelp and eelgrass and what we want from kelp and eelgrass. So that's the first piece of the prioritization framework. The next piece, if you click again, is opportunity and risk. So we want to prioritize areas which will generate the greatest return in long term and avoid areas which might be less resilient, for example, to future changes beyond our control. And then the third piece is feasibility. So we want to prioritize areas which we can meaningfully influence and monitor for success. So these are the three major categories of how we're thinking about the prioritization framework. Today, we are focused on a conversation about just the first piece, which is just the values framework. Next slide, please. Nope, sorry, one more. And how is this information from today going to be used? So today is the first of a series of public workshops, which will be used to inform development of the plan, creation of this framework, with regional workshops to occur in person and virtually in March of this year. And then after we hear your feedback on the plan, click please, DNR and our executive working group will create a draft framework that ties together some of these higher level values that you're providing to us to specific data sets that we can use to ensure that we're meeting those values for you and prioritize parcels of habitat for prioritization. Click please. We anticipate that this summer we'll have a draft ready to share for review, offering review first to tribes and then to the public. And then in fall, we will incorporate your feedback and submit our plan to the legislature. And more information about this entire process can be found on DNR's Kelp and Eelgrass website. Okay, next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about what kelp and eelgrass is, why it's important, and we touched on what the statewide plan entails. And now I want to focus on why we're all here today, which is to work together to start to chip away at what that prioritization framework means. Next slide, please. So we just talked about these three categories in the prioritization framework, which are essentially the questions that we will be asking ourselves when determining what parcels are prioritized for conservation and recovery. And like I mentioned today, we are focused on understanding the values category. So we want to know, why is kelp and eelgrass valuable to you? I know that folks have a lot of thoughts about feasibility and opportunity, and we're going to have a lot of opportunities to talk about those things in the future. I recognize it's going to be hard to disentangle some of these elements, but I encourage you to try and focus on answering the question posed here, which is, why is kelp and eelgrass valuable to you? What habitat provides these values that we want? Next slide. And just to clarify by what we mean about values, here we are talking about the quality of kelp forests and eelgrass meadows that support aquatic ecosystems, but also human uses. So like I mentioned, we want to understand what you want for or from kelp and eelgrass and why it's important to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we go into the discussion, I encourage you to think broadly about what valuable means. With our executive working group, we've crafted a draft list of some values which we're going to share with you today to solicit feedback and input, and we encourage you to add your own values if you don't see them represented here. We've organized these into three different groupings. So the first is ecological, click please. The next is economic, and then the third is sociocultural. And within each of these categories, we've come up with a list of potential values for your feedback and input of new values. So for example, within the ecological bucket, a value might be kelp and eelgrass provides critical finfish habitat. So you're interested in kelp and eelgrass because you value the fish habitat that it provides. If you click again, please. For economic, an example might be that you have an economic value of kelp and eelgrass because it supports commercial fisheries as habitat for finfish, for example. And then one more click, please. For socio-cultural, it could be that the indigenous cultural practices connected to kelp and eelgrass, for example, ceremonial salmon harvest supported by kelp and eelgrass role as habitat for finfish. So I use these examples to demonstrate that, in a lot of these categories, I think there's overlap between them, and it might be hard to parse your values into the buckets, but that's okay. We want to just understand what is most important to you, and we encourage you just to provide feedback of what you find is most valuable. So these are the categories and values that we're going to solicit information and feedback on in the coming breakout rooms. But before we do so, we want to pause for questions that might have come up. So as we answer questions, we're just going to put this reminders on the screen of what we just talked about, and I'll turn it back to Annie and Lucila to facilitate Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Max. Really thorough presentation and lots of incredible information to share in 20 minutes. So great job. So we have